It's wonderful. Thank you so much for the invitation to be with you and to share some of my thoughts on the current, well, we're calling it conflict at the crossroads, some of the current political situation that we are seeing in our country. So am I standing in the wrong place, or do I need to do anything? I'm sure someone will. So I have an hour now, fractionally under, and I have an hour and a half after the tea break, but I will split it up. Don't worry, I'm not going to talk at you for 2.5 hours, I promise. But I probably will deliver quite a lot of content in this first hour. That's the plan anyway. So in this first hour, I'm going to try and outline something of what I think is happening to us nationally at the moment. As I've been watching, you'll see, I've been kind of watching this for about 4 or 5 years. So I'm going to try and plot a little bit of the trajectory, and then I'm going to try and give a little bit of an evaluation of what I think might be going on, and perhaps just start to think about a little bit of theology around what's going on, but we'll pick up the theology after the coffee break. So that's my plan. I need to start with some definitions, and I need to do this partly because it's just a very sensible place to start, but partly because almost every term I'm going to use is really contested right now. And if we are incautious in our use of terms, then we can end up upsetting people that we don't want to upset. There are maybe some people we do need to upset, but I'm not looking to do that right now. So three definitions, and this is the hardest you're going to have to work all afternoon, I promise you. So I need to define liberal democracy, and probably many of you are fine and kind of on this page, but let me just define it because I'm going to use the term on a number of occasions in my time with you. So we all probably have a reasonable idea of what we mean by democracy, but what makes a democracy a liberal democracy? Well, it's these things, maybe some others as well, but these are perhaps the key things. Free and fair elections. It's not good enough just to have elections, they have to be free and fair. Separation of legislative, judicial and executive powers. That means that the people who make the laws are independent of those who adjudicate the laws, that's our judiciary, who are independent from those who execute the laws, and that's our police and our prison services. And that's a really important element of liberal democracy. And then we have independence of the press, and then the last two perhaps I'll put together, protection of minorities and freedom of speech. So if you have a democracy that is not a liberal democracy, then what the government can do, the government is elected by a majority of the people, but then they can act entirely in the interest of those who elected them, and they can end up marginalising, excluding, deporting perhaps those who didn't elect them. So liberal democracy requires all of these elements. Now, why did I say that? I said that because now I want to define the term far right. Now, this term is used by lots of different people in lots of different ways, and one of the key ways it's being used right now is to speak pejoratively about somebody who's to the right of us on the political spectrum that we don't like very much. And that's really not a helpful way of engaging in dialogue. Fortunately, there are better definitions, and this is the definition that I will be using in any time I use this term today. So I'm following the work of Kaz Mudder. Kaz Mudder is one of the specialists on far right, probably the international specialist on right-wing movements. And he splits right-wing movements into two broad categories, those which he calls mainstream and those which he calls far right. And by far right, he means those groups which pose a threat to liberal democracy, and that's why I needed to define that term first. And then he would then divide this further. I don't want to spend too long on this because I don't think we need to for today, but he would divide the far right further then into what he terms the extreme right, who want to dismantle democracy full stop. Classic examples of the extreme right would be Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler. Such groups do exist today. You're unlikely to bump into them because by their very definition they are illegal and therefore they are working underground. But they absolutely do exist. Happily, they are in very, very small numbers in this country right now. And then he uses the term the radical right, and he uses this to refer to groups which are not seeking to dismantle democracy, but which pose a threat to the liberal elements of democracy. And I would suggest that we are seeing quite a growth of this of this particular strand of our politics right now, and I will give evidence to support that statement in a minute. So when I use the language far right, that's what I mean by the term. I'm not using it inherently pejoratively, I'm using it descriptively. One more definition, and then you can relax a bit. I need to define the term Christian nationalism, which is being used a lot right now. And here I'm using the work of Andrew Whitehead and Sam Perry. Now they're writing in the American context, and we'll touch briefly later on some similarities and differences that we have with the American context here. But their definition works very nicely. If you just take the USA term out and insert UK or England or whatever, it works very nicely. So again, this is a term that different people use in different ways. And some Christians would say, I'm a Christian, I'm a patriot, and therefore I'm a Christian nationalist. And that use of the term Christian nationalism is not what I'm wanting to problematize today. So this is the definition that I am using today. Christian nationalism is a cultural framework, a collection of myths, traditions, symbols, narratives, and value systems that idealizes and advocates a fusion of Christianity with national civic life. There's your key term, a fusion of Christianity with, for us, British or English civic life. And they go on to say that the Christianity of Christian nationalism represents something more than religion. It is as ethnic and political as it is religious. So that's the definition that I will be working with, and I'll give you some examples of it in a minute or two. Okay, so I'm going to try now and give you a little bit of an overview of where we are right now and how we've got here over the last few years. So just a kind of about 6 slides, I think, to try and track some of the trajectories. So we will all know who this is. This is when he was leader of UKIP, and he's holding in his hand the UKIP manifesto from the 2015 general election. And he wrote the introduction to that manifesto. And in that introduction, he says, we need a much more muscular defence of our Christian heritage. And this is in a political manifesto. Now, around about the same time, we've got this particular group are quite active. Now, they still exist, and they haven't been proscribed yet, although I will say that the 2 individuals you can see on the left-hand side of the slide there have both, I believe, served time in prison for religiously aggravated or racially aggravated crimes. But the group itself hasn't yet been proscribed. But in 2014, 2015, they were particularly active, and they were leading a number of what they referred to as crusades. Very troubling choice of word, of course. So on the left, I keep switching things to make sure, yes, so it is still the left. On the left-hand side, you can see that they are leading a march, and this march is taking place in a Muslim majority area of one of our British cities, and they did it in a number of places, I think. And you can see that they are marching with Union flags and, most troublingly, with large white crosses. And they are chanting things like, Muslims go home, we're Christians here, you're not welcome, and other such things. And around the same time, they also led a number of actions against mosques, where they invaded mosques at time of prayer, handing out Bibles and political literature. And as I say, they referred to this as crusades, and really troubling me, it's all troubling to me, but really troublingly, Jada Franson, the woman that you can see there, describes this action as preaching the gospel. Okay, moving on, I'm going to whiz on now to 2023. So one of the groups that does a lot of investigation and research into these movements is an organisation called Hope Not Hate. And every year they publish a number of publications, but one of them is a kind of review of the previous year, and they call it the State of Hate. So the State of Hate 2024, which obviously was looking at 2023, contains this sentence: the radical right, now this is an example of people using different terms, similar terms for different things, and so we can just say far right for our purposes. The far right is blossoming. 2023 is the year it came of age. And they say that because they felt that at that point it had moved out of the kind of the splinter groups, the very small groups like this. It moved much more into mainstream political discourse. Now, I would say that, and we would all agree, that it did not reach a pinnacle in 2023. So, moving on, let's move on to April of 2024. So this is a story from Bristol, where I live. And Bristol Cathedral, for a number of years, has done something which I understand is a historic tradition from Christians in the Middle East, I believe, which is to open their premises to local Muslims for a grand iftar. So in other words, during Ramadan, one of the evenings when they're breaking their fast, they get together, have a feast, and invite others who aren't Muslims to join them. So this took place in April of 2024, as it had on previous years. It began in College Green, which is the grassy area outside the cathedral. Started to rain, and they were invited inside, which was always plan B. No act of worship, either Christian or Muslim, took place. This was simply people eating together and children playing alongside their families and so on. Now, this particular individual you can see here, who's a Christian cleric in he's been defrocked for at least one denomination, but he keeps finding another one to accredit him. His name's Calvin Robinson, and he took to Twitter to denounce this when he heard about it. And he said, this is evidence that we are now living in the Islamic Caliphate of Great Britain. And because he is somebody who is platformed by Twitter rather than deplatformed, I mean, our number of readings of every tweet that we send out, we've stopped doing it now because we used to get 2,000 for the CSBV, now we get 20. It's really interesting. But he clearly is, the algorithm is serving him. And therefore, he had a huge response thread to that original tweet. And here are some direct quotations from that response. And I've underlined some words because I want you to notice the use of us and them, and who it is including and who it is excluding. So we direct quotations from that Twitter thread. Defend our land. We have been conquered. They took over Hagia Sophia in 1453. Now they've seized the UK without firing a shot. Exorcise the cathedral. And perhaps most troublingly of all, we need a new crusade. So that was April of 2024. Then in July of 2024, Tommy Robinson held a rally in Trafalgar Square. And commentators who watched this rally, so sort of secular commentators, The Guardian, for example, and Hope Not Hate and one or two others, they all commented on the fact that this was the first time that they had seen such an abundance of Christian symbolism and imagery being used both in the crowd and on the platform. Now, let me just say right now, I have no interest in criticising people who attend this rally or the next one that I'm going to describe. People turned up to support these things for a whole range of reasons. And it is a cheap shot to try and flatten that out into a single ideology and criticise people who are standing in the audience, and I have no interest in doing that. But I'm very interested in who gets handed a microphone and what they choose to say. So on the right-hand side of your slide, you can see a man called Ricky Doolan, who's a pastor. I think it's a church in London that he leads, and he was leading some. He had a gospel choir, interestingly, largely black gospel choir, a small one, but a group on the stage with him. Led lots of worship songs and sang Jerusalem. And as you can see, he's wearing a Union Jack, and he's flanked by a flag that says Jesus is King. And then the individual on the left, a man called Kai Dewar, who is a bishop in the Confessing Anglican Church. So this is not part of the Church of England or the Anglican Communion. It's a small independent denomination. And he gave a bellicose speech, about 5 minutes long. You can find it online. And here are some direct quotations from that speech. We are not at war with just the Muslim. And then a little bit later on, he says, I will fight for this cause and the gospel of Jesus Christ. This nation of ours is under attack. Today, when I look out across this square, I don't pray for revival in the land. Because today, standing in Trafalgar Square, I can see in thousands of faces that revival has already begun. So what we're seeing here, for the first time really, in a very visible and public way, we are seeing the explicit conflation of a political rally with Christian revival. So as I've been watching and commentating on these movements, this is the point really where I start using the language of Christian nationalism rather than simply referring to the far right, because I think this moment, at least among some individuals in these movements, this moment has tipped over into Christian nationalism by the definition that I offered a minute ago. Now, UKIP is kind of re-emerging on the political scene, and it's led by this man called Nick Tenconi. On the right, you can see two stills from a video which he posted on his Twitter feed. I just want to be really clear that this is not second-hand sources or slurs. This is something that he posted on his own Twitter feed, where he gives a Nazi salute. And that was in August of this year. Roughly the same time as that rally in Trafalgar Square, there was another, I think, smaller rally where he gave a speech, and he said this: detain and deport all illegal invaders, detain and deport all Islamists, detain and deport all who are here to colonize, detain and deport all those who refuse to assimilate. And then later in the same speech, he calculates that the people who would be caught by that net and detained and deported would be 5 million people in our country. And then as he comes into the close of his speech, he says, "The new right rises, and as God is my witness, we will take our country back. And when we do, it will be for his glory." So here again, you can see the conflation of political rhetoric with Christian language. And then we get to the Unite the Kingdom rally that took place in September last year. So probably around 150,000 people showed up. It was in Whitehall. And again, I'm not interested in criticising people who showed up. I'm interested in people who were standing on the platform and what they said. So we've got some of the same individuals that I've already named. In addition, we've got this man called Brian Tamaki, who is a pastor from New Zealand. And he comes with a haka troupe, and they do a very prolonged haka, at the end of which they performatively tear up a number of flags, including one that says Palestine. And then he gives a short speech. And I'm giving you a direct quotation from his speech, because I don't want to appear to be, or I don't indeed want to be, kind of reporting it secondhand. So he says this: "This is a religious war. It's Jesus Christ versus Satan. It's Christianity versus the rest." And then he says this: "Ban any type of public expression in our Christian nation from other religions. Ban halal, ban burqas, ban mosques, temples, shrines. We don't want those in our countries." So that was September 25, and that's the point at which, as I observe things, the British Church started really paying attention. So this is the point at which I started getting a lot of emails. And then I need to, for the sake of completeness and fairness, I need to report on the carol service that took place just before Christmas. Now, I'm part of a WhatsApp group of Christians who are concerned about these movements, and some are theorists and some are practitioners, and more people get added all the time, and it's all getting a bit unwieldy. But what's interesting is that when Tommy Robinson announced that this carol service was going to be happening, he announced it, I think, probably about the first week of December, there was an enormous flurry of activity on our WhatsApp group. A lot of people were trying to work out how to respond, whether to respond, what to do, how to act wisely. So at this point, I felt that it was about time that I showed up at one of these events. So far, what I've told you, I have taken it from video evidence, so I'm not just listening to what people are saying, I'm watching it for myself, but I felt it was about time that I stood in the crowd, and believe me, I had other things I'd like to have been doing a week before Christmas. But anyway, I took a trip to London for the day. So the crowd was consisting, again, I'm not interested in criticising those who are in the crowd, but just to notice that the crowd was split, to my observation, kind of three ways. There were observers, like myself. There were quite a lot of observers, I think. There were Christians. I mean, I confess to being in both camps, but you know what I'm saying. There were people who came to observe, and there were people who came to worship. And then there were people who came on the kind of the patriotism label. And again, these groups can mix. I'm not saying they're entirely distinct, but you get a sense that there were three main motivations for people showing up. The rally was mainly, but absolutely not entirely, white, and there were a lot of working class people, a lot of families there as well. And it was a much smaller crowd, probably 1,000 to 2,000 people. And it was carols, prayers and scripture. Tommy Robinson had promised it would not be a political event, it would be a worship service, and I have to say, he spoke truth It was a worship service, not a political event. And he spoke right at the very end, after there'd been a final blessing, but we'd had carols, we had a lot of scripture, more scripture than I have ever heard in a Baptist church on a Sunday, I can tell you. A lot of scripture, a lot of prayers, explicit gospel calls. Felt like a bit of an old-style kind of tent revival meeting sort of thing. I didn't like it all. It was a bit muscular at times, but it was a Christian worship service. And Tommy Robinson spoke at the end, and he spoke very briefly. He didn't speak politically, and it was quite moving, actually, what he said. He spoke about having become a Christian in prison, and for the first time I listened to that and thought, oh, maybe you really have, because I'd kind of heard the narrative out there and I'd been pretty sceptical about it. And he spoke about feeling, and a number of people had said this already on the platform, being rejected by the church, about a sense of we're not welcome in the church, and the we was probably the white working class. I mean, it wasn't explicit, but that was kind of what was implicit, was we're not welcome. And they particularly had a go at the Church of England, and whether that is because that's the national church and the very visible church, or whether there is something specific about how they had related to the Church of England, I think the jury's out. But I do think that we as Baptists also need to hear that, because it was very sad to hear. And I walked away thinking, I just wonder if possibly there might be a turning point going on here. No pun intended. Having said that, I'm not encouraged. I'm now signed up to Tommy Robinson's emails, and he emails me several times a week by name, which is quite troubling. And I'm not encouraged by what's coming out. But we need to, in my opinion, we need to believe that Jesus Christ can meet anybody and turn their life around. We read that in the book of Acts. And we also need to respond with great wisdom and not with naivety. Okay, so that's something of what's been happening over the last sort of 6 or 7 years here in this country. Let me give you a little bit of analysis as I see it. I'm going to offer you this model, and I'm going to use it a few times, so I'm just going to spend a moment to make sure that I've made it clear. So I would suggest that on any of the issues which polarises us right now, that we can plot opinions on that issue on a range. So choose the ideology in your mind, and there will be a range of perspectives, and you can plot those on a graph from right to left, for the sake of argument. Now, I would suggest that within a liberal democracy, there has to be room for disagreement. In fact, if I went out and went to London and surveyed 2,000 people on, I don't know, immigration or something, and everybody gave me exactly the same opinion, I would not conclude, oh, we live in a liberal democracy. I'd think I'd accidentally walked into North Korea. So we have to be able to encompass a range of perspectives within a liberal democracy. But I think we also have to be able to say there are boundaries, and it's possible to offer an opinion or perspective which we would consider invalid within a liberal democracy. So you notice I'm not at the moment saying what fits into these categories. I want to offer this as a kind of model for our thinking. So for the sake of having a term to use, I'm going to say that so obviously the ellipse, the purple ellipse, is what we would consider acceptable within a liberal democracy. And those that sit beyond it, I'm referring to as extreme for the sake of a term. And those who sit within it, I'm referring to as moderates. Is this making kind of sense? Let me just show you how it might work with one of the most polarizing issues of our day. So there will be some people in this room for whom you should put the jam onto your scone first. You're wrong, but it's okay to believe that in a liberal democracy. Okay. There are some people in this room who know that you should put the cream on first, and you're right, absolutely. And that also is a perspective that should be okay within liberal democracy. And there are some crazy people in this room who don't want jam and cream on their scone, and you're wrong as well, but we'll tolerate you because this is a liberal democracy. Okay. But there are some people, notionally, I've never actually met any such person, who would suggest that maybe I have met such a person now, that if you want to put jam on your scone before cream, you should be thrown into prison without trial. Okay. Now, I would suggest that is an opinion that sits beyond the liberal democracy bubble, and likewise on the other side. But what I want you to notice is that whichever side we look at, the moderates and the extremes, broadly speaking, they agree with each other. They have the cream first ideology or the jam first ideology. But what they disagree with is the extent to which they want to impose that on those that they disagree with. But it's important to notice that broadly speaking, they share an ideology that end and the same thing this end. Does that make sense? Good. So I've been thinking a lot, among other things, I've been thinking a lot around the polarisation that's taking place in our nation right now. And this, I think, is one of the things that is driving this polarisation. You see, I'm hearing a lot of people that I would consider moderate on any one of these issues that is polarising us right now, speaking about other people that I would also consider moderate and saying, you are far left or you are far right. I'm hearing that a lot. And I think the dynamic is that the moderates are being fed a narrative by their own wing, by the extremes on their own wing. And the extreme people on their own wing are saying to their own moderates, those moderates, except they're not using that language, they're extremes. And so these two moderates are now hearing that the other ones are extremes. They start calling each other those names. And of course, if I, yell at you and tell you you're an extreme cream first person or something, you're not going to walk warmly towards me and say, let's dialogue, let's sit down for a coffee. You're going to probably start calling me names too, and gradually we're going to pull further and further apart. And so it is, in my view, the polarisation that is driving moderates apart is very troubling, and it's being fed by those who are on the extremes. And that's by, explicit targeting, it's by echo chambers, it's by algorithms and social media, it's by a whole load of ways that this is operating. Okay, how am I doing? Right. So at this point, I'm going to try and sketch the approximate territory of ideologies that we're talking about. And the slide I'm going to put up in a minute has got two columns. And the column on the left, I'll go down, I'll go through it. And the column on the left is perspectives that can sit in moderate forms. They're not always held in moderate forms, but they could at least theoretically be held in a moderate way. And then on the right, I've got a column that has perspectives that have taken those that can be moderate and taken it to ways that I would consider extreme. So I'm just going to go through that. What I would say is that many of these movements are quite heterogeneous. They're quite mixed. So you may struggle to find somebody who ticks every single one of these boxes. People tend to have a bit of a mix and match. Anti-Semitism in particular is very variable. In the far right. Some far right groups, we'll come to this in a second, but some far right groups are virulently anti-Semitic and others are virulently Zionist, and some seem to manage to do both. Okay, so this is roughly what I would consider the territory that we're talking about. So, some perspectives that can be held in moderate ways. Concern around immigration and desire for tighter border control. Concern around the growth of or influence of Islam. Sense of Christian marginalisation or persecution in the country, patriotism, concerns around loss of English or British identity, concern for our armed forces and veterans, conservative stance on issues of human sexuality and gender identity, preference of individual freedom over responsibility to the group, that's probably more common in the States, desire to recover a Christian nation, but they certainly can be seen there. So whether or not we agree or disagree on these matters, I hope that we can broadly agree that they can be held in moderate ways. But they can also be taken to extremes. So here are some examples. Punitive and hostile attitudes to immigrants for whatever reason they have come into our country, and perhaps however long they have lived here. Hate speech or violence towards people who aren't straight and cis. Covert or overt racism. Attempt to suppress freedom of speech. This is not limited to those on the right, but it is seen on the right-hand side. A conflation of, actually it's kind of a three-way thing really, a conflation of being Christian with being English, of being Christian with being white, and then of being English and being white. And you often see a kind of a three-way kind of conflation there. Suppression of freedom of religion and anti-Muslim rhetoric. Promotion of false claims, this matches the kind of conspiracism one, again, not limited to those on the right. And anti-Semitic speech or action. So as I say, you might struggle to find someone who signs up to all of those, but that's kind of an indicative cluster of beliefs and ideologies. I thought it might be helpful just to briefly ask the question of how this compares with the US. Because I imagine that many of you, like me, are watching what's going on there with real concern. So there are significant points of similarity, but also some important points of difference. Now, interestingly, for a long while, as I've been talking about this over the last few years, I would have said that, so America has this founding myth of being a city on a hill. It was spoken on one of the Puritan boats by a pastor called John Winthrop as they were coming over, and the Puritans really established this kind of proto-nation as a Christian nation, as a Christian kind of settlement, and took this kind of idea that they were a city on a hill, and that's now become written into the kind of corporate self-understanding of America. Almost every US president ever has used this, I think. And I would have said until recently that America has this founding myth, and we don't have a founding myth. And actually, over the last 6 months, I've heard a new founding myth that is going around now. And remember, myth doesn't mean something that isn't true. It means something that is used to kind of to organise an ideology, perhaps. It's an idea that underlies a way of a self-perception. So I am increasingly hearing the founding myth of King Alfred. Just out of interest, who's heard this in the last little while? Not many, one or two. Okay. So what I'm hearing is, and this may be historically correct, I just don't understand how it has any relevance to the present moment, that King Alfred unites the English tribes and kind of creates England for the first time, and he does it explicitly as a Christian nation, and therefore England is the first or maybe the only country that was ever from it, for ab initio was a Christian country. That may, I'm not a historian, that may well be a reasonably accurate statement of affairs. What I don't understand is why that would have any power in the current moment. So apparently we now have a founding myth as well, but it's a different one from the States. You will, I'm sure, have noticed that there is a much greater emphasis on Latinos as being a threat in the States, and probably reflects much more how Muslims are viewed as a threat in this country. Obviously in the States you've got a whole lot of stuff about individual freedom and gun rights, which happily we don't have over here. I think conspiracism seems to be a notch higher in the States. We definitely have conspiracisms here, but at the moment they're not quite so, they don't have quite such a hold on the public imagination. And I think although these movements do tend to be populist, which isn't a term I defined, but you probably know roughly what I mean by it, that I think the populism is a notch higher in the States, the almost deification of Donald Trump. Happily, we haven't quite got there yet with some of these individuals leading these movements. Let's hope we never do. And the other thing, of course, that's distinct for us is we have 4 nations and we have kind of different nationalisms. I was speaking at an event in Wales 10 days ago, and there sort of nationalism is a very popular idea, and it doesn't inherently carry the problematic elements that I've been talking about. So we have to be a little bit careful about the terms that we're using and what we mean by them. Now, one of the things that, at the bottom of the slide there, one of the things we need to realise is that evangelical Christian movements transcend the Atlantic in very significant ways, generally speaking coming from the US to the UK. But things like the New Apostolic Reformation, the Bethel movement and Hillsong, which I realise starts in the States but has a very significant influence in both America and here. These movements are using some of these ideas, and they are almost serving as a kind of conduit for some of these ideas to transfer across, sometimes without some of their contextual meaning, and yet somehow transfer across and lodge in the British scene. So I think that these movements are helping the British scene to be a little bit, they're tending to homogenise the two in a way that otherwise we might have continue to be more distinct. Okay, I'm coming into land, you'll be glad to know. Right. So just a bit of thinking about the theology of these movements and why they appeal to Christians. And it is interesting to reflect. Now, these movements have appeal across large portions of society now. And it's important that we don't collapse them down to a particular demographic. It's really important because we end up speaking really unhelpfully and othering about people of certain demographics if we take a naive and flat view of these movements. Let me say right now, these movements have a heck of a lot of money behind them, and that is not coming from the White Council estates. So it is an exercise that's beyond my expertise really, but it is an interesting exercise to map what it is about these movements that is appealing to farmers, for example. What is it about these movements that is appealing to those on the White Council estates? What is it about these movements that is appealing to Middle England, and so on? Because there will be different elements that will appeal to different parts of society, I think. What I'm particularly interested in, of course, is what is the appeal to Christians, recognising, of course, that there will be Christians in all the groups I've just named. So these things are complex. But what is it about these groups, these movements, that explicitly appeals to people of the Christian faith? So here are some thoughts, again not necessarily a complete set or a final word, but for many Christians in this country, loss of Christian visibility in society is a real concern. And kind of the converse of that, I suppose, is the visible growth in Islam in our country. And we do need to notice the census data. Now, I would want to ask the question of what people meant when they ticked the Christian box in 2001 compared to what they meant when they ticked it in 2021, because I think things have changed there. So I'm not sure that the fall from 71 million to 27 million is quite a like-for-like comparison. But nonetheless, on the surface, we can see that the statistics are dropping substantially for those who would say in this country that they are Christian. And on the other hand, those who would tick the Islam box on the census have risen 2.5-fold over 20 years. Now, the absolute numbers are still a very long way apart. We need to notice that. But for some people, these statistics and the kind of visible representation of them that they will perhaps see when they walk about their cities, for example, some people find this really troubling. Some Christians are very concerned about some of the things that have been or are currently going through our parliament around beginning of life, end of life, same-sex marriage and trans issues. Some Christians are very concerned about that. And so you'll see that that the groups that I have that kind of cluster of ideologies that I represented a minute ago would find a home among some of these concerns, or perhaps I should say it the other way around. I want you to hear that I'm not commenting myself on the validity of these perspectives or the invalidity of these perspectives. I'm just trying to name the fact that these perspectives exist. Now I keep adjusting this slide, so this is probably not my final word, but this is my best attempt right now to try and analyse the relationship between these political movements and Christianity. And as I say, I do keep changing this, partly because I'm getting better at it, and partly because it's a moving field. So I think broadly speaking, we've got two different groups. Acknowledging again that the political actors I'm going to discuss in a minute, some of them will be Christians, okay. But broadly speaking, we've got two different groups who, in my view, are cynically co-opting each other because they think they can get something out of this relationship. So we've got certain political actors who see in the church and in the Christian story something that will give them credibility, and perhaps a possibility of expanding their support base. I've started using the term sometimes of church washing. I wondered, I don't know, this isn't a formed opinion, but it's a speculation of whether that was the reason that the Tommy Robinson Carroll event was quite so Christian and not at all political. It would have served a church washing agenda very well. I don't know if that is what was in his mind, we'll see. So these are the political actors I'm talking about, and the way that I think that they might be wanting some of the benefits of collaboration with the Christian faith and those who represent it. On the other side, then, we have certain influential Christians, perhaps like some of the people I described on the platforms, who see in these movements the opportunity to gain power and influence. And again, I don't want to adjudicate on the question of whether this is cynical or whether this is genuine, whether they are wanting genuinely to see the church flourish and grow in this country, and they think that this will be a good way of going about it, or whether there is something more personally self-serving in it. I'm not going to comment on that right now, so don't hear me making a value judgment on that, but simply to say that I think these two groups then see in each other something that they can benefit from, and they form this, what I would call a cynical mutual co-option. And out of that, they generate, now this is a direct quotation from that slide almost at the beginning, from the Christian nationalism definition. So out of this collaboration, they are generating a collection of myths, traditions, symbols, narratives, and value systems. And then they are effectively selling that, promoting that to the general population. And as they are doing that, they are, what's the word I'm looking for, leveraging many of the fractures and pains that are present in our nation right now. A sense of hopelessness, financial precarity, rapid social bewilderment at rapid social change, loss of identity, and fear. And they are both, in my view, they're both exploiting fear and they are engendering fear. And so they kind of promote this cultural framework to the general population. And they see what sticks, as it were. And where does it stick? It sticks among some Christians, for the reasons that I have perhaps outlined, and cultural Christians. And I don't use that term pejoratively. Many people would use that of themselves. Richard Dawkins says, I'm a cultural Christian, and we'll all know that he's an atheist. So cultural Christians are people who appreciate something of the traditions, perhaps something of the ethics and value systems of the Christian faith, but who would not say Jesus Christ is Lord, or wouldn't say Jesus Christ is my Lord. So that's my best account of what I think is driving some of these movements right now. Now, some of you will know the story, the kind of medieval story, I think it is, of Faust, who is a made-up story, of course, but Faust sold his soul to the devil to gain money or influence or something or other. And I would like to suggest that some of these movements, some of these groups are effectively offering the church a Faustian pact. They are saying, well, they're not explicitly saying, but they're implying, sell us your soul and we'll grow your influence. Now, this quotation is from the States. It's from a particularly nasty, I think, illegal group. I'm not positive about that, in the States, called Occidental Descent. And this is from about 7 or 8 years ago, from the executive director of that group. And he said these words. He's using the language of outright. Again, like I say, people use different terms in different ways. But for us, we can just hear far right here. So he says this: the outright shouldn't get hung up on being anti-Christian, because Christianity is infinitely malleable. After we seize power and get on television, the outright will be celebrated as Christian. And I find that deeply chilling, because I think that is exactly what we're seeing in the States today. And I fear that this is something that we are starting to see in pockets of the church today as well. Okay. You're going to have a whole load of discussions around the Quiet Revival with Phil tomorrow, which I think will be great. But I just want to name right now that there are interesting questions around the Quiet Revival and how it may or may not intersect with this cultural moment. Because, and some of you will know this better than me, I'm sure, but some of the young men in particular who are rocking up to churches kind of out of the blue without any previous relationship. Some of them, I think, are probably seeking something that is kind of muscular and structured and cultural, and perhaps not quite knowing what they're seeking. Now, of course, that's not for a moment me saying we say to them, get lost, but we need to be perhaps sensitive to some of the dynamics that might be at work there. And we need to be really wise about the way that we disciple these young men. But you're going to talk about that for a lot tomorrow, so I'll leave that to Phil. So just as we come into land, I want to just comment briefly then on the theologies that I think are at work in these groups. And I think broadly speaking, they fall into two types. So first of all, I think that there are what I would call thin theologies at work. And by a thin theology, I mean the use of slogans and images that don't carry the content that you and I would normally connect with these. So if I say Jesus is king, and I believe Jesus is king, and I also believe that Jesus is king is something we should be prepared to speak into the public square. So this is one of the reasons why it's really complex to talk about these issues. But when I say Jesus is king, entailed in that is I'm thinking about his progression into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday on a donkey. I'm thinking about him wearing a Roman crown of thorns. I'm thinking about his eschatological kingship. I don't think that a political actor who walks around saying Christ is king has any of that depth to what he is saying or she is saying. That they are saying something that is far more political and thin, if you see what I mean by that. And likewise, the use of the cross as an image in the way that is represented there. When you and I think about the cross, we think about the suffering death of Jesus for us, for the sins of the world. I don't think that is what is being meant when these individuals are walking with the cross through the street. So this is what I would call a thin ideology. And friends, you're leading churches, and my exhortation to you is that you equip your churches to smell a rat when they hear these thin ideologies, that they don't just say Jesus is king. Yes, this must be a great movement because I believe Jesus is king too. However, it is also fair and important to say that not everybody who is in these movements is simply using thin ideologies. There are Christians in these movements who have thought very carefully about what they say and do and have a well-formed political theology. In my view, it's wrong, but nonetheless it is well-formed, and we do nobody any service if we respond to thick theologies, to well-reasoned theologies with name-calling and slogans of our own. Then we're actually contributing to the polarisation. So I'm not going to go into these in detail. In fact, I'm definitely not going to go into them in detail. But I will just name perhaps 4 of the well-formed political theologies that are out there right now, which need really good and sophisticated and careful and nuanced engagement and don't need name-calling. We shouldn't be calling anyone names at any point, but you know what I'm saying. So one of them is dominionism, and in its most egregious, in my view, its most egregious form, but there are much more moderate versions of this, but in its most egregious form, there's a book by a man called Stephen Wolfe, writing in the American context. Anyone read it? Good, don't. It's really, you really don't want to. It's called In Defense of Christian Nationalism, and he argues from God's command to Adam and Eve in Genesis 1, that he argues that having dominion is about being in the image of God, and he manages somehow to argue that it's only men who have it, and therefore at the fall that is lost. The image of God is lost at the fall, which I dispute. Dominion is lost at the fall, which I also dispute. And that is then restored on conversion, and therefore only Christian men should rule. And women shouldn't have the vote. So that's the most egregious version of dominionism. But it is, I think it's wholly wrong, but it is carefully argued, it is exhaustively argued. It's about 350 pages or something. Okay, so that's one theology that we need to engage with carefully. Going the wrong way. Second is the whole idea of restoring a Christian Britain. I spoke about King Alfred a minute ago. We are getting political theologies based on that, which need careful attention. They're not just nonsense. I think they're wrong, but they're not just nonsense that we can just bat out of court. Related to that, and this would be what Danny Kruger argued in the Houses of Parliament last summer. So he argues that the church has a historic role in establishing Britain's culture of tolerance. In other words, the church has been enormously influential in getting to where we are today. And I agree. I think it's been, the gospel and the church has been phenomenally significant in the development of our country. But where he then takes it is an argument about what that should mean for a beefed up version of the established church. And obviously, I don't agree with him on that. But it's not a thoughtless argument. It's a well thought out argument. I've got his book Covenant on my table waiting to be read. I got 2 copies of it for Christmas. And fourthly, I'm also hearing a lot of people starting to use the idea that God's dealings with Old Testament Israel somehow map onto how modern nation states might regard themselves. And that, in my opinion, is both historically wrong, because modern nation state is something that only came into being at the Treaty of Westphalia hundreds and hundreds of years later. And secondly, of course, I think it's theologically wrong, because we should regard Old Testament Israel as sui generis. It is of its own kind. God is doing something unique there in salvation history, which is not replicated in modern nation states. But these are four of the arguments, well thought out, well argued arguments, which are out there at the moment and which are helping to promote some of these groups. And they deserve careful and considered attention. Not by everybody, but certainly by those who are called to do those sorts of things for the sake of the church. I'd like to suggest that there's a lot of theological thinking that needs to be done, and it's in a number of different areas. And I think that sometimes I'm only starting to see for myself quite recently kind of the breadth of questions that need theological engagement. So the ideologies themselves that are so divisive, each of those needs good theological engagement. And of course, I'm not implying that good theological engagement is going to settle the position for us all. I get that. But nonetheless, we mustn't be responding to any of these issues out of a knee-jerk, but out of a sense of theological maturity with these questions. But they are not the only things that we need to reflect on, in my opinion. So the polarisation of society, I showed you that diagram earlier, and I talked a bit about how I think it might be operating. That needs good theological reflection. It needs us to think about how we as church might be contributing, to how we as church might help to alleviate. There's important thinking to be done there. Among Baptists, perhaps this next one is a more settled question, to some extent perhaps. So to what extent should the church be engaged in politics, and what might that look like? To what extent should individuals be engaged in the political sphere, and what might that look like? These are questions that need consideration. I've got a daughter who's one of the care parliamentary interns this year. That's very interesting, because she's actually coming at this question along with the peer she's working for, from a politics side of things, and I'm coming from the theology side of things, and we've been in the same room professionally, which is not something I'd at all expected. But I'm very interested in what Christians are doing in the parliamentary area at the moment, and what's going on in politics more generally. There are missional questions as well. We might touch on these in a little while. Do we regard this current moment as a threat, as an opportunity, as something else, some combination of those, or something else? These are things that we should reflect on carefully together, in my opinion. Now, the next point, last time I spoke about this, it was misunderstood. So there is a lot of brokenness in our nation, in our nations right now. And I'm interested in the question of how we as church might consider that as our pastoral response to that. The way I was misunderstood was I was heard to be endorsing the kind of the established church idea of, and anyone who knows me will know that I wasn't doing that. But what would it mean for us as church what does it mean? Of course, many of us are doing this already, but to think of ourselves as pastor to this broken nation that we're part of. And I think there are questions, back to the Faustian Pact sort of idea, there are questions to be thought about regard to the character, we might even say the soul of the church in our moment. And I think those things need reflection as well. So none of that is doing any theological reflection, but I'm trying to at least map some territory which we do need. I would suggest that we, the church, need to be thinking about. I'm going to now offer, about half a dozen thoughts that might fire off some ideas for you. So I want to talk first of all about the offering of power which these groups are offering the church. And you will very well know about the temptations of Jesus and how very rich and complex those temptations are. I think we could have a whole Lent preaching series on those temptations. But if I had to collapse them down to a sentence or two, I would say Jesus comes to instantiate the kingdom of God, and what Satan offers him is you can do it quickly, you can do it cheaply, you can do it without the pain and without the suffering, and you can do it loudly and by power and violence. That is how I would perhaps summarise that. And of course, Jesus resists that temptation. He has that temptation every single day. He's got a zealot among his disciples. That invitation is there every single day. I'm interested in the feeding of the 5,000. There were many, you'll know, there were many attempts in Jesus' time to throw off the Roman yoke. And the way you do it is you go out to the desert and you assemble an army, and then you equip them, and then in you come. And that had been done many times before. So when Jesus is out in the wilderness and he feeds 5,000 men, and maybe this is why we're told it is men, and as Mark has it, they sit down in hundreds and fifties, and then as John tells us at the end, they want to make him king by force. And it's interesting that all the gospel accounts, if I remember correctly, they all have Jesus scarpering really quickly after that moment. And I think that moment is a kind of enacted version of the temptation that Satan offers him, turn these stones to bread. And it's a temptation that Jesus resists. I want to just to rattle a few more people now, because I want to suggest that these three temptations, which I might then summarise as popularity and populism, or something like that, temptation to spectacle over substance, or to presentation over content, if you like. That's the kind of throw yourself down off the temple sort of thing. And the temptation to, bow down to me and all these can be yours. I'd like to suggest that these are temptations that are active on both sides of the political spectrum. Wherever we happen to sit, I'd like to suggest that these are something that we need to wrestle with. So I've spoken quite a lot about the right-hand side of the political spectrum, the attraction of political power, the attraction of cultural Christianity without discipleship. We could map that perhaps to the kind of spectacle over substance sort of idea. The faith in the leader, the political idolatry, which we are seeing absolutely writ large in the States right now, but we are definitely seeing it in our own nation as well. We've talked about those, but I'd like to suggest on the other side of both the theological and the political spectrum, and they don't always sit together, but sometimes they do, we see we see those temptations playing out as well. They just look a bit different. So the temptation to popularity kind of plays out, in my view, among the enormous power of shaming, which we see particularly in social media, but in general discourse. One of the things I think about quite a lot is the question of how do we build a bridge to bring people back in? Because actually we the nation, we the society, we're really good at shaming people. We see it in the political sphere, don't we? If Party X says to the government, do this, have this policy. The government adopts this policy, and then they go, U-turn. Like, why don't they say, great, we've been promoting this. This is a welcome response. We are really good at shaming people. How can we build bridges to bring people back in ways that are face-saving? Some of these people have built an entire platform on this particular promotion of this particular ideology. How do we invite them back in? If we've thought about cultural Christianity without discipleship, on the other side we might see social justice fruits, sometimes without the Christian roots. And political idolatry is as powerful on the left as it is on the right. The desire to put the faith, perhaps not so much in the leader, but the faith in the movement. There is one name in heaven and earth by which we may be saved, and it is not a political party. And so often, I think we respond to a politicisation of the gospel, and our instinctual response is to give a counter-politicisation of the gospel. And I'd like to suggest that is unhelpful. So, there we are, rattled a few more people. Right, let's move on. Daniel 7, in my opinion, is the best badly known chapter in the Old Testament. We probably all know the second half or the middle part of Daniel 7. But let's start with the beginning part of it. I'm just interested. Has anyone preached on Daniel 7 in the last 2 or 3 years? Oh, you're missing a trick. Oh, good, excellent. I think Daniel 7 is wonderful. So, it's the point at which the book starts getting a bit weird, and we tend to turn the page at this point. But we've got these 4 beasts emerging out of the sea, and they are interpreted for us at the end of the chapter. We're told that these are world rulers. They probably represent Babylon, Persia, Greece and Rome, but it doesn't really matter which empires they represent, because what they are as a mass is a powerful critique. It's a powerful critique of human leadership. It's a powerful political theology that Daniel is presenting us with. Because these beasts that come out of the sea, they're like no beast you've ever seen. They're like some Frankenstein's monster. There's kind of this hideous mishmash of teeth and wings and claws. And the hideousness of their appearance is reflected in the violence of their action, because we're told that they tear and crush and destroy. But worse than this, all of these beasts, or at least two of these beasts explicitly, are representing themselves as human. One of them is propped up at its back legs and starts speaking like a man. Another one claims dominion, which of course is the specific thing that God has given to his people in the Garden of Eden. We referred to it earlier. It's a human prerogative and responsibility. And so put all that together, and what Daniel is giving us is he is saying all human power will become bestial if it is not held to account. All human power systems. Ultimately, they present as human and humane, but ultimately they are all somehow subhuman. Because actually, there has only been one true human ever, hasn't there? And of course, that's what the second half of the middle part of the chapter does. We have thrones set up in heaven, and the Ancient of Days comes and takes his seat. And but hang on, that was thrones plural. That's a bit of a shock in its moment, in its canonical moment. And then, of course, into the presence of the Ancient of Days comes one like a son of man. And in Daniel's day, that simply means a human. But we all recognize that language because Jesus uses it of himself again and again and again, precisely because of this chapter. And so this Son of Man takes his throne beside the Ancient of Days, and to him is given authority and dominion. He is the true one to whom dominion belongs. He is the only true human, and all other human power structures are thereby relativized and are exposed as ultimately tending to the bestial. It is an electrifying chapter. Please go and read it again. I think that this next slide will sit very naturally with us as Baptists, but it's worth saying in any case. There is a narrative out there right now being put either deceitfully or in misunderstanding, one or the other, or both, there's a false dichotomy. That if the church doesn't get in bed with the state, if the church doesn't ally itself with power, then we will lose all ability to speak in the public sphere, and we will end up meeting in cupboards. That is just not true. There are other models of church, and the most powerful one, in my opinion, and it's the one that I think is our self-understanding here, is the church's prophetic role. And the church, with a prophetic role to society, requires no one's permission, and it requires no privilege. In actual fact, I would suggest that privilege gets in the way of a prophetic responsibility to society. Martin Luther King says that the church is neither the ruler of the state nor its servant, but its conscience. And that is quite a good way of articulating, I think, the prophetic role of the church. Kind of underlying a lot of what we've already said, but we'll name it clearly, that the kingdom of God, Jesus speaks very clearly about what the kingdom of God is like, and he speaks about mustard seed and yeast. These are things that grow quietly and slowly and patiently. It doesn't come like a juggernaut. I've been thinking a lot more recently about that third one I've listed there, which is one we talk about less perhaps, or perhaps it's just me. But the one that the farmer goes and sows the seed, and then he sows the seed in the field, and then he goes home and puts his feet up and watches Traitors or something equivalent, And the seed just gets on growing because it is God that gives it the increase. And there's something remarkably humbling about that for us as pastors, isn't there? But this is how the kingdom of God grows, and there's an invitation there to well, I almost say to trust the process, to trust the Spirit. One of the instincts, a good instinct, I guess, that I think we're seeing at the moment, particularly with people who kind of join rallies with banners that say Christ is King, is they are wanting to declaim that in the public square, and they are wanting perhaps to invite others to step into the kingship of Jesus, I suppose. But I would suggest that, I think there is a utilitarianism at the heart of some of these movements, some of the Christians' involvement with these movements, by which I mean they see a goal which they think is a good goal. Perhaps it's the church having more prominence in society, perhaps, whatever you want to say the goal is. And then they will do what they need to do in order to achieve that goal. And they will, in particular, as I'm looking at it, they will make alliances with some really dodgy political figures. who perhaps some of whom have served time in prison for violent offences and fraud. And I would like to suggest that we need to simply have confidence that Christ is King, and we don't need to put him on the throne. Yes, we are called to declare it, but we don't need to put him on the throne. We certainly don't need to make dodgy deals with dodgy political actors to put him there. Now, I've been thinking quite a lot recently about Jesus' words about removing the plank from my own eye. And this is my thinking about what it might mean for us, wherever we sit on that political spectrum. What does it mean for us to remove the planks from our own eyes and attend more to that? And if you remember what I said when I put the cream and the jam slide up, that I said, look, the moderates and the extremes, they broadly agree in their ideology, and what they differ on is perhaps the extent to which they want to impose that. And the same on the other side. They broadly agree with each other as well. I think what it means to attend to the plank in my own eye is to attend to the problematization of my ideology and worry a lot less about the problematization of someone else's ideology. You see, if instead of listening to the extreme voices telling me that those other moderates are extremes, if I actually turn to them and say, how dare you take my good and reasonable and moderate opinions and make them something hateful and divisive? How dare you do that? I will not defend you. I am going to say to you, this is not okay. Then maybe if people on the other side do the same, then maybe we moderates can once again start to listen to one another and to dialogue together. And this is what I think it means to attend to the plank in our own eye, in our own time. I'm hearing, and of course this happens on both sides, but just to give you an example from the right side, I'm hearing some really good Christians that I love and admire saying, well, Tommy Robinson's got a point. And I think that is not how you do it. You turn to the likes of Tommy Robinson and say, that is not okay. That is not okay. And the other side as well, of course. We will all know that one of the most beautiful descriptions of Jesus from John's prologue is that he is full of grace and truth. And so one of the things I think we need to grapple with is the question of what do I do when I believe I am right? Now, obviously, there's a whole lot of stuff around being willing to be teachable and learn, and we discern in community, and all of these things are important. But when I have wrestled with something, and I'm convinced, at least for now, that I have something true to say, how can I speak it in grace? You know, Job's friends, their theology is not that bad. It's pretty sharp, actually. It's pretty much in line with the book of Proverbs. And they apply it like a brick. And that's the problem. One of the things that I'm seeing a lot of among those who want to resist the narratives of the far right is I'm seeing a lot of othering going on. And this is, I guess, why I started with saying I'm really not interested in criticising people who show up to rallies, because they come with a whole lot of different reasons. But one of the things I'm seeing is people who are disturbed by the othering language towards Muslims, like the sort of thing that I gave you some quotations from at the beginning. That othering language, which digs deep ditches of polarisation in our culture. And I'm very disturbed by that. But the answer is not to start othering the people who are doing it in a way that mirrors the violence of their rhetoric and their conduct. And I think this is such a temptation for us. And I'm seeing it all the time. I'm looking for a good slide to represent this, but I'm seeing this all the time of people kind of, as it were, shouting at people for digging ditches in our society. And as they're doing it, they're kind of digging their own ditch. And I know that I've done that at times as well. Jesus tells us, one of the things I hear quite a lot at the moment is, oh, it's not for me to judge. Yeah, we are absolutely called to discern. Judgment, of course, is God's alone, but we are called to discern, and we must discern. The apostle tells us to test the spirits. Jesus says you will know the false prophets by their fruit. Fruit and the shape of the fruit is a pretty good evaluative principle if we look at these movements. And Jesus says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, or dare I say, not everybody who stands on a platform with Christ as King behind them will enter the kingdom of heaven. I think I wrote, after the Paris Olympics, you remember that big furore around the Paris opening ceremony of the Paris Olympics? I think I wrote a blog entitled something like The Sacred Virtue of Not Overreacting. I'd like to suggest that there is a bit of a tendency of us on both sides of this great gulf at the moment to overreact. And while we really need to take things seriously, we need to be prepared to speak prophetically and boldly. We need to be prepared to uphold public truth and hold people to account. All of these things are important. But let's try not to overreact. Because we end up reinforcing polarisation. Good listening. It's a really valuable thing to sit down with people and say, why do you think this? Why do you think the way you do? And we can learn an awful lot. And we can start to understand and love people even if we continue to disagree with them. This, I suppose, would be, some of these apply more to people on one side of the spectrum than the other. But the tendency to deny what is evidently true is an absolute fundamental flaw of, let me rephrase this slightly more moderately. It is a tendency that I think Christians on all sides of the political and theological debate are tempted into. That we deny, we will gloss the situation to present our own argument to its best. And I just say, let's be honest. Let's be honest. Maybe this is part of the attending to the plank in our own eye thing. Let's be honest. Let's not deny what is evidently true. Let's not try and silence. Compassion is not a zero-sum game. And one of the things I guess I'm seeing, I think I touched it was on a previous slide, but I didn't talk about it, was that on one side of the political spectrum, we are seeing a lot of compassion towards what we might call, white deprivation, and a lot of lack of compassion towards people who have come to our country from war-torn zones and don't share the same skin colour as many of us. But on the other side, we can see the opposite. And we're seeing people who are really compassionate towards those who've fled to our shores and those who are not white and living in situations of concern and marginalisation. And sometimes there is an absolute lack of compassion towards people who who've never held a job and whose fathers never held a job, and people who live with an abusive landlord and they can't get their damp fixed, and they can't get a job because there's no infrastructure to get across town to where the jobs are. Compassion is not a zero-sum game, and one of the things we really need to do is join up our compassion, I think, and not put them into competition with one another. And final point here before we break out a little bit into groups. We don't need to make up a new story. I guess this is kind of back to the question of the counter-politicisation of the gospel, but we don't need to make up a new story. When we see the politicisation of, for example, the Christmas narrative, we don't need to politicise the Christmas narrative differently. We just need to keep going with the old story that saved the Apostle Paul, and it saved Martin Luther, or let's say Augustine, it saved Luther, and it saved Spurgeon, and it saved you and me. It's good enough. It's been good enough through the ages. We don't need to keep reinventing it. And I think there's a nervousness, there's an anxiety right now that perhaps is tempting us to try and reinvent things. Right, I'm going to propose, what are we doing? Good. I'm going to propose a bit of workshopping then. I've got some, I think what I'll do, I've got some questions, and I've got them spread across 3 or 4 slides, which is maximally unhelpful. So you might like to take a picture if you think this question might be of use to you. I'm going to throw out some questions, and then I'm going to invite you to discuss whatever you want to out of the questions or the content or what you're having for dinner. Okay, is that all right? So here are some questions to consider. This is the question around whether this cultural Christianity rise is an opportunity or a threat. We might want to ask the question of what is it that people are seeking when they say they're claiming to be Christian, newly claiming to be Christian. What do these movements tell us about spiritual hunger? We might want to think, some of you will be familiar with Niebuhr's framework of Christ against culture, Christ of culture, Christ as the fulfillment of culture, Christ in tension with culture, Christ the converter of culture. If you're familiar with that framework, or even if you've just because I've run through it now, what's the tension between capturing the spirit of the age and being captured by it? There is, in some of these movements, particularly among Gen Z young men, there's a surprising appetite for structure and discipline. And I'm wondering if we need to reevaluate some of our missional strategies right now. So that's one set of questions. Some questions around politics and faith. Well, I think the first one isn't a question, but how should we take the conversation off the political spectrum and keep the main thing? What might that look like? Not everyone is a Guardian reader. Has the church typically been too middle class? I think the next one again isn't a question, but invent a question around that. And the final one, how can the church help to heal, help to address the polarisation in our society? Everyone got that who wants it? Thinking about multiculturality and interfaith relationships and conversations. What does the current moment tell us about desire for identity, and how might that challenge us and make us think about our engagement? How do we dialogue with people of other faiths in this particular moment? What does it mean to live out welcome and inclusion as gospel values? It's worth noting the value of multi-ethnic church, and the immigrants are renewing the UK church. Okay, and one more. What are the deep issues in our society, the deep fractures in society perhaps, that this moment is bringing to the fore? How do our own positions on the political and theological spectrums influence our response? Let me just close out then with just a few kind of practical thoughts. So just to kind of let you know what I've personally been doing. In 2023, I led this consultation, which was a mixture. It was largely Christian, but we had some representatives from other faiths and one or two people who had no faith. It was a combination of academics and practitioners. It was more multiracial than it looks like in that image. And out of that consultation, our research question really was, what should the church do? How should the British church respond to the use by far-right groups of Christian language and imagery? And this was 23, this was before the Unite the Kingdom rally and stuff happening. So out of that consultation came that book, which is attempting to kind of in some way replicate the conversation. But at the end of that, so it's an edited book, at the end of that I offer some of the things that I'd heard, as it were, from being in the room for 24 hours with these guys, so 10 recommendations, which I'll fly through. But some of them we've already spoken about, well, probably most of them we've already spoken about really. Speak humbly and acknowledge Christian complicity with historic and contemporary harms and abuses. Disavow violence done in the name of Christ really clearly, particularly at senior denominational level. Avoid stereotyping people, whether that's stereotyping of Muslims, stereotyping of white working class, for example. Promote dialogue. Be curious, try and understand why people feel the way they do. And out of that curiosity, notice the structural things that are driving these movements among more marginalised people groups, marginalised communities. Lean into being prophetic, including, radical love, potentially non-violent protest. Refund youth work. These movements are actively seeking to groom and recruit young people, and young people who are untethered, who don't have a kind of community that loves them and where they feel that they belong. They are really vulnerable to these groups. Build biblical literacy. I hadn't started using the language of learning to smell a rat, but is that, help our congregations to have sufficient literacy that they smell a rat when these thin ideologies and theologies are promoted. And learn from history, draw on the wisdom of the dissenting traditions, which we've already talked about. So that was my kind of 10 recommendations at that time. And I managed to get some grant money. I kind of touted that around the country a bit. And then about 9 months ago, the publisher wrote to me and said, Helen, will you just do a toolkit? And I said, no, I won't write a toolkit, but I will edit a toolkit. So this is now with the publisher. It'll be out in June, God willing. And it's lots of short contributions. Do you remember Michael Mosley, the TV doctor, radio doctor? One Small Thing was it called? He had, I brush my teeth standing on one leg because Michael Mosley says it'll make me live longer. One Small Thing. It's kind of based on that. What you're busy ministers, you've got other priorities. What small things might you be able to do to make a difference in this particular question? So, and I've got lots of brilliant people who are already doing some of these things, who've all contributed to short chapters. There's lots of snappy things that you can read on the, on a bus journey sort of thing, and a little bit of theology woven through. And the headings under which there's about 4 or 5 chapters under each, just to kind of give you a flavour. Ways of giving young people purpose and a home. Ways of helping people to feel embedded with and belonging to a church. How can we help our congregations to grow in intercultural understanding and to grow in compassion towards people who deserve our compassion? How can we deepen our understanding of our own faith and have sufficient religious literacy that we understand and respect the faith of others? Religious literacy, in my view, is a comment about not about the church, but about a society. I think it's very low and very weak at the moment, and I think that's a real problem. There are some traps and things that we can fall into if we're not haven't got our brain switched on about or just haven't kind of thought about these things deeply. So I've got a section on that. For example, who do I rent my church rooms out to? How do I work out whether this is a group that's going to, use my premises for nefarious purposes? How do we think and speak well? How can we cultivate critical thinking, good dialogue in our congregations? How can we help young people and, all our congregations to speak and listen well to one another? And how can we operate with, in partnership with others beyond the church to tackle some of the systematic injustices in our society which provide seed beds for these movements to grow? So you'll be doing many of these things already, and one of the big things I want to close with really is let's not be anxious. We need to be bold, we need to be courageous, we need to be prepared to speak prophetically. We need to call out what is evil when we see what is evil, and even if we are afraid that might make us sound like we're colluding with something else, we need to be prepared to be courageous, but we don't need to be anxious. If we think about the kingdom of God growing like yeast, what is the yeast that is growing the kingdom of God? It's the quiet work that you guys are already doing week by week, of loving your neighbour and building community cohesion and preaching the gospel and ministering to those who are in need in your communities. This is the yeast out of which the kingdom of God grows, and you guys are doing it already. So I'll mentor what you're doing and keep doing it, and Christ is King. Thank you.